The heat didn't arrive quietly that summer. It settled over the street like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating, turning every afternoon into a test of endurance. Asphalt shimmered, mailboxes burned to the touch, and the air itself felt hostile, as if breathing required effort. On our street, people adjusted their lives around the heat, walking dogs before sunrise, closing curtains tight, and avoiding eye contact outside so no one would feel obligated to stay and talk. It was during those first brutal days that I noticed how often people paused near my driveway, wiping sweat from their faces, scanning the street as if hoping for relief that never came. Delivery drivers lingered longer than usual. Kids stopped their bikes under the only patch of shade. An elderly man once sat on the curb, pretending to tie his shoe while catching his breath. None of this felt dramatic at first, just the quiet discomfort of too much sun. But something about it bothered me. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was punishing. And in a neighborhood built on rules, schedules, and appearances, there was no rule that addressed something as simple as helping someone who was thirsty. So I did the simplest thing I could think of. I dragged an old blue cooler to the edge of my driveway, filled it with ice and bottled water, and taped a handwritten note to the lid: "Free water. Take one. Stay safe." That was it. No announcements. No attention seeking. Just water, sitting quietly in the heat like a small act of resistance against indifference. At first, people hesitated. They looked around, checked for cameras, glanced back toward their homes. Then someone took a bottle. Then another. By the end of the day, the cooler was half empty, the ice already melting faster than I expected. Watching people drink, smile, nod in thanks, it felt right. It felt human. I refilled the cooler every morning after that. It became part of my routine, as normal as checking the mail. But something else changed too. I noticed curtains shifting. Doors closing a little too quickly. A strange tension settled in the air, heavier than the heat itself, like the street was holding its breath. The first warning came quietly, slipped into my mailbox like an accusation disguised as paper. The letter was polite, sterile, and unsettlingly cheerful. It informed me that my property was out of compliance due to an unauthorized object visible from the street. No mention of water. No mention of people. Just rules. I read it twice, then looked at the cooler, sitting there innocently, beads of condensation running down its sides. I laughed at first. Surely this was a misunderstanding. Who would object to free water in extreme heat? But the next day, another notice arrived. Then another. Each one colder than the last. Fines began to appear, numbers printed neatly, emotionless, stacking up like a quiet threat. The letters didn't ask me to stop. They expected me to. The tone wasn't angry, it was worse. It was certain. Like the outcome had already been decided, and my role was simply to comply. I tried to reason with the HOA board. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were redirected. When I finally spoke to someone in person, they smiled and explained that the rules existed to maintain order and uniformity. They used words like liability and precedent, as if kindness were a dangerous contagion. I asked them if anyone had been harmed by the water. They avoided the question. Instead, they reminded me that exceptions created problems, and problems attracted attention. That night, I stood by my window and watched the street. People still came for water, but now they moved faster, shoulders hunched, bottles hidden under shirts or in bags. No one lingered anymore. The cooler hadn't just become a source of relief, it had become a risk. And somehow, that made it feel even more necessary to keep it there. The heat worsened. Days blurred together in waves of light and exhaustion. I noticed people drinking less, staying inside longer. A delivery truck stalled at the corner one afternoon, the driver sitting inside with the door open, head resting against the steering wheel. I offered him water. He thanked me quietly, like we were sharing a secret. That's when the fines escalated. Not gradually. Suddenly. One day it was a warning. The next, it was a number so large it made my stomach drop. The letters stopped pretending to be suggestions. They used words like violation, penalty, enforcement. I realized then that this wasn't about the cooler anymore. It was about control. About reminding everyone on the street who decided what was allowed and what wasn't. Something strange happened after that. The street felt different. Quieter. Not peaceful, tense. The cooler was still there, but fewer people came. When they did, they looked around first, as if expecting someone to step out and stop them. At night, I started hearing things. Doors opening softly. Footsteps that didn't belong to anyone I could see. Once, I woke up to find the cooler lid open, the ice untouched, the bottles rearranged as if someone had inspected them carefully and left without taking anything. The next morning, another notice appeared, this one warning of further action. I stared at the paper for a long time, wondering how offering water had turned into something that felt like defiance. I considered giving in. It would have been easy. Remove the cooler, pay the fines, return to silence. That's what the rules wanted. But every time I thought about it, I remembered the faces of the people who had needed that water. The quiet gratitude. The relief. So instead of stopping, I talked to my neighbors. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just conversations. On porches. At mailboxes. In shaded corners of the street. I listened. And I realized something important. I wasn't the only one who felt something was wrong. Others had stories too, about warnings over small things, about rules that seemed designed less to help and more to remind. The cooler wasn't the problem. It was just the thing that made the problem visible. The tension finally broke during a meeting that felt less like a discussion and more like a reckoning. The room was crowded, hot despite the air conditioning, filled with people who had spent too long swallowing frustration. I spoke last. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue policy. I talked about heat. About thirst. About how a neighborhood should feel when things get hard. I looked around and saw nods. Tight jaws. People leaning forward. The rules were read aloud again, but this time they sounded hollow. Like words disconnected from reality. When the votes were cast, the silence was unbearable. And then it was over. The fines disappeared. The warnings stopped. No announcement was made, but the change was unmistakable. The next morning, I put the cooler out as usual. This time, someone had added to it more bottles, neatly arranged. Then someone else added a second cooler. Another neighbor put out cups. Shade umbrellas appeared along the sidewalk. No one said anything at first. We just acted. Quietly. Together. The street didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt alive again, not because the heat had gone away, but because people had decided to take care of one another despite it. By the end of summer, the cooler was no longer mine. It belonged to the street. Kids refilled it. Neighbors checked the ice. Strangers stopped without fear. And every time someone drank, it felt like a small victory, not over rules, but over the idea that kindness needs permission. The heat eventually faded, but something else remained. A memory. A lesson. That even when systems try to ban empathy, it finds a way to survive. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is a simple act, left out in the open, daring others to remember what being human feels like.